Hey there, everyone. It is the 28th of March, 2021, and this morning we're going to finish our look at Daniel. We're just looking at a kind of a character study of him and seeing what he has to say to us in the 21st century. And what we find with Daniel, I think, is a man who gives these very admirable qualities that all of us can imitate if we choose to. I mean, it is within our power to be able to imitate these great examples like Daniel. I think that's why they're given to us in Scripture. One of the things we may think sometimes is, well, this is the cream of the crop, right? These are the guys, these are the women. I mean, in the case of women like Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Ruth, or Esther, we think, well, these are those special people that made it into history, right? And I think that is a mistake because the Bible is filled with ordinary people who do extraordinary things because they serve an extraordinary God. And that is, I think, the key. Because left to ourselves, I think any one of us could be thoroughly mediocre and just simply be content with that. But through Scripture, God prompts us to excellence. He prompts us to be better parents or better children or more diligent workers or more cautious in our relationships about things that could damage those relationships. And so we have this great body of material in Scripture that actually pushes us and prompts and drives us toward excellence. And so we're actually going to look at that this morning because I think we see that with Daniel. Now, Daniel obviously is extremely talented. That's part of the reason why he was taken off by the Babylonians, because what invaders did, like that did, whether it's the Assyrians or the Babylonians, is they would come in and take away all of the really skilled people. So everybody who could read and write, people who were artisans, people who were talented in some way or another, had administrative skills, they would go in and just capture these folks and take them away and use them for their own purposes. And so Daniel and his friends clearly are talented people. They've been taken to Babylon because of their skills, because of their talents, and their promise, right? Very promising prospects. And so there's a reason why Daniel is able to rise so high in the Babylonian government, and his three friends too, right? If you recall earlier in Daniel in the book. His three friends are very impressive in their own right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, when we look at people like Daniel, I think what we find is that people like him who have exceptional talent will often face one of two reactions. And those reactions are either admiration or jealousy. Either or, and maybe both, depending on their peers. But when you have someone whose talent exceeds that of their colleagues, you may be admired and respected, or and people will use you as a model for themselves. They'll look up to you and see you as a kind of a prompt for them making more of their own talents and own abilities. But then you've got others who will view that person or view you as someone who is an overachiever and makes them look bad, right? In high school. I don't even know if they still do this. I mean, I don't even know if some places still give grades or not. But somebody who would break the curve, right? That is a threat to your academic career if you have a curve breaker, right, in class. Somebody who does really, really well and the rest of you do just like, mediocre. Or someone who's a good moral example. and it makes other people look bad because you always obey the rules, and so you're a goody two shoes, right? And so or you're self right, or you're a holy roller, right? You're more righteous than other people, and so you get criticized for those things. You get criticized because you decide that you are going to pursue excellence, and other people do not have the same dedication that you do. Now they could probably do maybe as well as you do if they just put the time and effort into it, but they don't. And so, unfortunately, we live in a society, and I see it more and more all the time, that demonizes excellence, right? And so, anyone who is exceptional, anyone who is super talented, it depends on a lot of other factors whether we accept them or not, or whether we demonize them. And that's really not fair, but that's something that happens. And of course, that's going to happen with Christians as well. And I think it happens with Daniel, because here's a man who is Jewish, and that probably played a part in the discrimination we see against him in chapter 6, because that's where we see the episode of Daniel in the lion's den. That's what we're talking about this morning. We see that his colleagues become conspirators to try to take him down, or try to get him in trouble, or maybe get him fired, maybe get him killed. And so these are people who, the text says, knew they were not going to find any fault with him except with his religion. That's the only place they were going to be able to get him, because it was different than what the Persians worshiped. The Persians worshipped Eastern gods, and so it was very different from Daniel's way of doing things. Well, because Daniel did an excellent job in his career, because he was good at what he did, they weren't going to find any fault with him. He put the time in. He put the energy and the effort in. He did an outstanding job because he committed himself to doing that. Now, that's reading between the lines a little bit, but I think that's a defensible thing to say, because they knew that when it came to his job performance, the text says they weren't going to find any fault with him. It was only going to be with his religion. And so he seems to be an outstanding citizen, seems to be the model worker. And so that may have actually caused the resentment of his peers. Well, I think Christians can be in the same kind of boat at times, because as Christians, we're called to excellence, right? Whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might, right? And so what we have is a lifestyle where you recognize that you don't deserve a job, but when you get a job, you do it very well, because that is just simply what's expected. As part of the Christian life, striving for excellence, that's what you would expect from somebody who has a faithful commitment to Christ, to strive to do the best possible job they can. Well, that's going to earn the resentment of other people who don't share your convictions or my convictions. And so maybe they are committed to just doing the minimum. And I see this a lot in our society. People go to work because they need to have a job, and so they do the bare minimum that's asked of them so that they can get paid and take that money and go do what they really want to do. They really don't want to put in a hard day's work. They really don't want to impress their job or impress their boss or go that extra mile to satisfy maybe a customer, right? They just want to do the bare minimum so that they don't get fired and still get paid, right? That was not Daniel. That may have been his peers. That may have been his colleagues in the Persian government, but it was not Daniel, right? And so what happens is these other conspirators get together, and they find a way to get prayer to any other entity outlawed except to Darius, who is the who is the ruler of Persia at this time. And so they go in with a plan to pass legislation that Daniel will violate, because they know that he's great at his job. They know he's also a man of faith, and they know he's also a man of conviction. Now, all of these things stand out, right? And that's a lesson for you and me as Christians, because what we're called to do is to go out into all the world and spread the gospel, making disciples of all nations, right? Jesus' last words in the Gospel of Matthew. You've got the illustration that Jesus uses in the Sermon on the Mount of being salt and light, right? Those are two things that are very noticeable, and they are maybe even more noticeable when they're missing. So that's the kind of faith you and I are supposed to be living out, a faith that is noticeable when people see it, and it's also noticeable when we are absent, right? Because we just bring something different. We bring something new and refreshing to wherever it is that we are, right? This is Daniel. Daniel has a faith that is not on display, right? It doesn't seek the spotlight, but it is conspicuous. And I think that's a lesson for us as well. We don't necessarily go around blowing our own trumpet, right? I mean, Jesus talks about that in the Sermon on the Mount also, right? Matthew chapter 6, don't blow a trumpet. Don't go out and make everybody aware of what you do when it comes to your religious activities. But at the same time, we have to kind of straddle that fence. Don't be an attention grabber, but at the same time, be conspicuous. And that seems like that's kind of a fine line to walk. But it's something that Christ asks, and so clearly it's within our power to be able to do that. Anybody can do that if we really put in the time and effort. Well, when the conspirators go to get this legislation passed, it seems to Darius maybe something that was very logical, right? And maybe even very flattering to him. Can't recognize anybody but you for 30 days. And, hey, what emperor, what king wouldn't like a little recognition, right? That kind of goes with the territory when it comes to being an emperor of, the largest nation on earth up to that point, right? Which is what Persia was. And so what happens is shortly, Daniel is going to face a crisis of faith, right? He is going to have to make a choice. Do I continue with my religious activities, or do I stop and offend God? Who am I going to offend, man or God? And of course, for somebody like Daniel and for somebody like us, that decision should be fairly clear. We offend man if there is any offense to be involved. If it means we have to avoid offending God, right? And so that's what he chooses to do. Well, what Daniel does is he makes no compromises with his faith. He makes no compromises about what he does. And when we go to Daniel chapter 6, verse 11, it seems to indicate that Daniel's rivals sort of caught him in the act. And what that means is, as he is praying, maybe asking God for help, the conspirators discover him. And then they go to the king. Oh, king, didn't you pass this legislation that said nobody should be given any kind of religious devotion except for you? Well, we found Daniel doing exactly that to his God, and so now we've got a problem, right? So now Daniel is in deep trouble because of his supposed insubordination. Well, this is I think, where we see what value Daniel brings in many ways. First of all, he's not going to compromise on his faith. No compromise at all. And that's what we're called to do, right? Because the moment we compromise is the moment we say something else other than God's will is most important. Okay, that's what religious compromise is. Something other than God and his will is more important than obeying him, right? And so And so what we have here is that Darius is extremely displeased. I think for someone like Darius, he understands that he's been had. Okay, he's been manipulated. He's had his subordinates trick him into doing something that ties his hands, and he's now required to do something that is clearly sought after by these individuals. And so you never like the idea of someone getting one over on you, right? You never like the idea of being tricked or trapped or set up. That's where Darius is, and he's furious. I have to imagine he's absolutely furious at this. He thinks they've played him for a fool. And so what now happens is Daniel has to go be thrown into the lion's den. And what we see here, and it is an absolutely marvelous statement of faith on the part of the king. It is where Daniel's being led to the lion's den, and he is already tried to deliver Daniel. It says in verse 14, he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Okay, this is how valuable Daniel is to the king. He has done so well. He's been so committed. He has been such a fine employee that his king, who is a completely different religion, completely different race, comes in. Daniel's from a previous administration, right? The enemies of the Persians. And for all of his effort, for all of his talents and abilities and his loyalty, he has won over the king, and the king now has a personal relationship with him. I think there's a lesson there for us when it comes to being Christians and living out our faith in the workplace. But the king even says in verse 16 of chapter 6, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. So he is praying that Daniel's God save him. And so in verse 18, now kings in the ancient world, they didn't care about the average person. But in verse 18, you see he goes to his palace. It says he spent the night fasting, no diversions, no entertainment was brought to him, and sleep fled from him. He spent all night tossing and turning, imagining what has happened to his employee of the century, right? Well, this says something about Daniel. It says, then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Now, I don't think we could underestimate what a harrowing night Daniel has had, right? He has been in a lion's den. He could be eaten at any moment, but he prays, and it says that an angel came to stop the mouths of the lions. And they have not harmed him. Daniel says, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Right? He reminds the king that he hasn't done anything wrong. And then the king is glad. Daniel's taken up out of the den. But here's where we see a kind of a down note in the story. The king commanded the men who had maliciously accused Daniel, this is verse 24, were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Now, this is a little bit of exaggerated language, right? Because it's almost kind of like, you see them, they jump down into the lion's den, and before they hit the bottom, the lions have already jumped up and grabbed them and eaten them practically, right? And so you see a little bit of exaggeration here, but it's for a point, right? The biblical writers did use exaggeration at times, but it was for a point, just like we use exaggeration. What they're doing, and I think I'm kind of reading this into the text, but what the the writer is doing is showing that these were lions who were hungry. Now, that is something that, as I understand it, is a very, very important feature, because a lion that's just eaten isn't really dangerous, from what I understand. I'm not a veterinarian, I'm not a lion expert, but from what I understand is that a lion that has been fed is not really a dangerous animal. But what you find here is that as soon as these guys, now Daniel's taken up out of the den, the king commands, these people are brought in. It seems like it's almost like a swap, right? Daniel comes out, everything's okay. Hey, go get the conspirators. They're brought in, they're dumped in, and the lions tear them to shreds immediately. That seems to indicate to me, and this is how I understand it, the lions were actually hungry. There's no reason why the lions shouldn't have eaten Daniel right there. Just jumped all over each other trying to get a morsel of Daniel. Okay, so they're hungry, they're dangerous. There is no reason why they shouldn't have eaten him, except that God stopped them. Okay, that's a little minor note. Well, I think it's actually kind of an important note, but you have to kind of read in between the lines to get that. Okay, but it's very important because it shows the lions were hungry. There's no reason why Daniel shouldn't have been a dead man, except that God intervened and stopped the lions' mouths. And so, when Darius throws in the other guys, they eat them immediately, right? It's a very small note, a very small point, but I think a really important point. And then Darius then makes a declaration, peace be to you, or peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. And then it breaks into poetry, and he has this magnificent statement about being the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Well, this is something that is pretty remarkable, because kings in the ancient world really didn't care much about other people, right? I mean, it's kind of the thing about being a celebrity, right? You don't really care about the little people. Now, you might care about somebody who's a little higher on the totem pole, but ultimately you think about self, right? And kings were very often very, very arrogant people. But here we have Daniel, who is such a fine man, so committed, so devoted, such a thoughtful and hard-working, committed employee, that he naturally earns the admiration and the affection of someone who, may, for all we know, was one of the most arrogant people on the face of the earth. This is the power of living the Christian life. And the thing is, Daniel must have been really talented. But a lot of what Daniel did is within the power of every single one of us. Every single one of us can live the Daniel life. And to an extent, our results will vary, right? But every single one of us can live a life where we win over the affections of other people who may be very different from us. And that is the power of the gospel working out in our lives. Because it's not us, right? There are a lot of people in this world that I just don't have a lot in common with. But I have a faith that's in common with some of these people. And because of that, we get along very, very well. All right, there are people here at New York Avenue. I mean, I grew up differently. I look differently. I sound different. I have very little in common, but we can go out and it's the kind of range of differences where the world says, well, you guys should actually be at each other's throats. You should disagree and fight over stuff, actually. But because we're Christians, We have so much that's all that we need to have in common to enjoy each other's company, right? That's the power of the gospel. That's the power of Christianity. And it's something that I think is within the power of every single one of us to be able to put into practice in our lives. And if we did that, what would stop the church from growing like gangbusters? Right? What would stop the church if we all lived a Daniel kind of life and naturally through our talents, through our abilities, through our convictions and devotion, we're naturally be able to be winsome and draw the affections of other people. The church would be the strongest it's ever been, right? And so, anyway, that's our conclusion with the life of Daniel. I hope it's been an interesting journey. I hope we've pointed out a few things that are maybe not common fare for Bible classes. I hope I've been able to dig in a little bit and give you a little bit of extra insight and understanding about this incredible example of faith that we can imitate if we just put in the time and effort, right? So anyway, well, that's our look. Next week we'll be looking at something a little bit different, and I will see you then.